The bank statement glared at me under the cold kitchen light. Every number was a betrayal. My savings gone, spent on a dream I didn't share. I sat there, silent, wondering if love could coexist with quiet disappointment. I had always trusted him. My son, grown and bold, convinced that I would never refuse him. Our small apartment smelled of old books and morning coffee, a fragile cocoon I thought could hold anything. But this morning something had shifted. A single click on my banking app had opened a window into choices I didn't make and futures I hadn't imagined. I had to decide. Follow his dream or carve my own. The laptop sat on the kitchen table, humming softly, like it knew something I didn't yet. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, reluctant. Outside, the rain tapped lightly against the windowpane, a gentle, persistent rhythm. Sounded almost like breathing. I clicked the banking app. The numbers stared back at me. Cold. Final. Every digit a reminder. My savings. My heart sank slowly, like a stone slipping beneath still water. I pressed my palms against the table. The wood was smooth, familiar, but it didn't offer comfort. Not today. I couldn't breathe right at first. Just a shallow, frantic rhythm that made the kitchen feel too small. The chair across from me was empty. My son had left hours ago. For what? I didn't know yet. But I could guess. The memory of him saying, "Mom, it'll be fun. For both of us," echoed softly. He smiled but not fully. There was excitement in his eyes, yes, but something else. Certainty, maybe, that I wouldn't refuse. I wanted to shake him, to ask why he hadn't come to me first. Why didn't he knock on the door and say, "I need this. Please." I leaned back, letting the chair creak beneath me. The floor remembered my weight. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, heavy and patient. The rain blurred the city outside. Cars moved slowly. People passed under umbrellas, heads down, small lives compressed beneath the gray sky. It all looked muted, as if the world was holding its breath along with me. Memories surfaced like soft, intrusive whispers. Each deposit I had made, careful, small, disciplined. Coins saved from groceries I didn't buy. Small overtime bonuses tucked away. Months of quiet patience. All for what? For a dream he had claimed as his own. I pressed my hands to my face. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, but I hadn't made any this morning. The kettle hadn't even whistled yet. My eyes fell on the stack of envelopes I'd been meaning to sort. Bills, postcards, letters I'd never sent. They seemed heavier now, as if they had absorbed some of my shock. I glanced at the window again. The rain streaked in long, uneven lines. The world outside seemed slower than usual, gray and soft, like it had noticed my grief and softened in response. A pigeon landed on the ledge, feathers slick with water. It looked around briefly, then took off, shaking off droplets as it went. I wanted to call him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. But I did none of those things. Sat, still, quiet. My throat felt thick. My chest felt tight. My mind was a whirl of why and how. The thought crept in, could this be love? Could spending my money without asking, insisting that it was for both of us, be an act of affection? Or was it just thoughtlessness, the carelessness of someone who thought they knew better than I did? The question twisted itself around my heart, small and sharp. I stood and walked to the counter. The tiles were cold under my bare feet. I picked up a mug, letting it warm my hands, but it didn't warm my chest. I stared at the kitchen wall. Faded paint. The faint scent of lavender from the candle I'd lit last night. The hum of the fridge. Ordinary things that suddenly felt foreign. I thought about our years together. Quiet mornings, evenings spent in mismatched silence. Moments stitched together by small routines and subtle laughter. All of it had led here, to this silent betrayal. Or maybe not betrayal, maybe it was just growth. His growth without me. A flash of memory. The first time I taught him to save. A little jar on the windowsill. Coins clinking. His proud, small smile. I'd wanted him to know the value of patience. The quiet satisfaction of accumulation. And now, the jar was empty too, in a way I hadn't anticipated. I walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. Outside, people moved in muted harmony with the rain. The city continued as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I could feel it in my bones, a subtle shift, a hollow where certainty used to live. I thought about what I could do. Could I follow him? Could I reclaim what was taken, or was it too late? The numbers in my account were absolute. There was no reversing them. Only the choice of how to respond. The rain slowed. A single shaft of gray light broke through the clouds, falling across the table where my laptop sat. The numbers still glared at me, unyielding. But the light softened the edges, just a little. Perhaps it was a hint, maybe a small opening. I sank into the chair again. My hands rested on the table. The laptop hummed beneath my fingers. Outside, the rain had stopped. Silence filled the space, thick and calm. I realized I could either stay frozen in anger and hurt, or find some way to move forward. Could this act, this sudden, thoughtless or loving act of his, become a turning point? Could I transform the emptiness into something mine? I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew I would have to try. The kitchen smelled faintly of rain now, a clean, wet scent that clung to the tiles and the counters. The light had softened, the city beyond the window a quiet blur of gray and green. I traced my fingers over the edge of the laptop, lingering on the cool metal. I didn't call him. Not yet. I didn't cry. Not yet. I only sat and watched the street below. The pigeon had returned, hopping along the ledge as if nothing had changed. But everything had. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the tiny pulse of something else beneath the ache. Something that could grow slowly. Something that could be mine regardless of the choices of another. The laptop hummed. The room was still. And I whispered softly to myself, more a thought than a sound, maybe this is the beginning of something different. The kettle clicked on, but it didn't make a sound yet. Just a small red light glowing on its side. I stood there watching it, as if it might speak first. Morning light slipped into the kitchen in thin lines, pale and unsure. The room felt wider than it should have. Empty but not clean. Like something had been removed and left an outline behind. I reached for the coffee jar, unscrewed the lid, and breathed in the smell of the grounds. Dark, bitter, familiar. I scooped carefully. One spoon. Then another. The sound of metal against glass echoed louder than it needed to. I noticed that. How quiet everything else was. The chair across from the table was pushed in. His chair. I hadn't moved it. I didn't want to. It felt like proof that he'd been here recently. That this wasn't all imagined. I set the mug down in front of the empty seat without thinking. Then I stopped. Left it there anyway. The kettle finally began to hum. Whoa. Patient. I leaned against the counter and waited. My mind tried to slow down, but it kept circling the same questions, like a bird trapped in a room. I thought about numbers again. About yesterday. About how quickly certainty can disappear. The kettle clicked off. Silence rushed back in. I poured the water slowly, watching steam rise and fog my glasses. For a moment everything blurred. Cabinets. A sink. The photos on the fridge. I lifted my glasses and wiped them on the hem of my sweater. The photos came back into focus. There we were at the beach years ago. He was smaller then. Sunburned nose. Too big smile. His arm slung around my shoulder like he was already protecting me. Another photo, graduation day. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit. I wore the same dress I always did to important things. I reached out and straightened one photo that didn't need fixing. My finger lingered on the corner. The coffee was ready, but I didn't drink it yet. I carried the mug to the table and sat down slowly. The chair creaked like it remembered me. Like it had been waiting. I wrapped my hands around the mug. The heat was comforting, but it didn't travel very far. Stayed in my palms. My chest still felt cold. I thought about calling him. The phone lay face down beside my notebook. I imagined his voice. Casual, cheerful, maybe a little rushed. I imagined myself asking, Why didn't you ask me first? And then stopping halfway through the sentence. I imagined the silence that would follow. I didn't like how any of it felt. The clock on the wall ticked loud. Each second stretched thin, then snapped. I took a sip of coffee. Too hot. I didn't react. Just swallowed carefully and set the mug down again. My eyes drifted to the notebook on the counter. The small one with the worn spine. I hadn't opened it in a long time. It sat there quietly, half hidden beneath a stack of unopened mail. I stood and picked it up. It felt lighter than I remembered. Or maybe my hands were stronger now. I ran my thumb along the edge of the pages. Bent corners. Faint smudges of ink. Opened it. The first page held a list. Not neat. Just honest. Places I had once written down. Things I wanted to do someday. Some were crossed out, others untouched. A few had question marks beside them, as if I'd already doubted myself back then. I closed the notebook gently and leaned against the counter again. The kitchen smelled like coffee now. Stronger. Warmer. Helped a little. I looked at the phone again. Still face down. Still quiet. Pride can be very quiet. So can fear. They sat with me in the kitchen like uninvited guests. Neither one said a word, but I knew they were there. I thought about how many times I'd said yes when I wanted to say later. How often I'd delayed my own wants until they grew faint and easy to ignore. Saving had felt responsible. It had felt like love. Now the savings were gone. But the wanting wasn't. That thought surprised me. It settled slowly like dust after movement. I realized the loss wasn't only money. It was control. And maybe, buried beneath that, an opportunity one hadn't planned for. The coffee had cooled. I took another sip. This time it tasted right. I carried the mug back to the table and sat down again, this time in my own chair. The empty one across from me stayed empty. I didn't fill it. Sunlight shifted slightly, reaching farther into the room. It caught the edge of the notebook, making the worn cover glow. Pulled it closer. Opened it again. I didn't write yet. I just looked. The pages waited. Patient. Like the kettle had earlier. Like the chair. Like the house itself. Outside, a car door slammed. Somewhere down the block someone laughed. Life was still happening. Even here. Even now. I picked up a pen and rolled it between my fingers. I didn't know what I would write. I didn't know what I would do next. But for the first time since seeing the empty balance, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief. Not forgiveness. Just space. I closed the notebook again and set it beside my mug. I finally turned the phone face up. No new messages. No missed calls. That was fine. I stood and rinsed the mug, listening to the water run. Sounded steady. Reliable. I liked that. When I turned it off, the kitchen returned to its quiet. But it felt different now. Less sharp. Less accusing. I glanced once more at the photos on the fridge. At the smiling boy who grew into a man who made choices without asking. I didn't remove the pictures. I didn't touch them this time. I just nodded to them. Like an acknowledgement. The notebook stayed on the table. But now, waiting for later. I stepped away from the kitchen window and into the hallway, leaving the coffee smell behind me. The silence followed, but it no longer felt empty. Felt like a pause. The hallway felt longer than usual that morning. Not darker. Just stretched. Light came in through the small window near the ceiling, thin and pale, catching dust in the air. It floated slowly, like it wasn't in a hurry to land anywhere. I stood still for a moment listening. The house made its familiar sounds, a pipe ticking, the soft hum of the refrigerator from the other room. It felt like the house was awake before me. Watching. I started walking without deciding where to go. My hand brushed the wall as I passed, fingers grazing old paint, chipped in places I'd meant to fix. I stopped in front of the coat rack near the door. The coat was still there, long dark, still smelling faintly of mothballs and something floral I couldn't place. I'd bought it years ago, for a winter trip that never happened. I remembered standing in the store, looking at myself in the mirror, thinking this is who I'll be then. Then never came. I slid my arm into one sleeve. The lining was cool against my skin. Fit. It always had. I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. Older now. Softer around the edges. The coat didn't change that. I took it off and hung it back carefully, smoothing the shoulder like it might feel insulted otherwise. The living room waited quietly. The curtains were half open, letting in a low gray light. The couch sagged where I always sat. I didn't sit. I walked past it and knelt in front of the old cabinet instead. Inside were boxes. I pulled one out and opened it. Postcards spilled slightly, their edges worn. Cities I'd never been to. Places I'd imagined myself walking through alone. I'd bought them over the years, sometimes from airport shops when dropping him off, sometimes from local stores that sold other people's dreams cheaply. I flipped through them slowly. Paris. Lisbon. Small village by the sea. Most were blank. A few had dates written lightly in pencil. Plans that never became sentences. I pictured myself writing to myself back then. You made it. You're okay. I hadn't trusted that version of me enough to send the card. I placed them back in the box and closed the lid. The cardboard made a soft, tired sound. In the bedroom, the air was cooler. The bed was neatly made, like I was expecting someone. I opened the wardrobe and pushed clothes aside until I found the dress. I hadn't worn it yet. Still had the tag tucked inside. I held it up by the hanger. The fabric caught the light, dull but honest. I remembered why I bought it. A dinner I never attended. A celebration I postponed because someone needed me. I pressed the dress against my chest and stood there, breathing. The room smelled faintly of clean laundry and old perfume. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the dress fall into my lap. The mattress dipped beneath me, familiar and forgiving. I stared at the wall. A faint crack ran diagonally above the headboard. I'd stopped noticing it years ago. My life flashed in pieces, not scenes. Lunchboxes, late nights, quiet sacrifices I never named. All reasonable, all loving, and now quiet. I folded the dress and put it back. Carefully. The wind picked up outside. I heard it before I felt it, a low rush against the building. It pressed gently against the window, making it rattle once. Not angry, just persistent. I moved closer and rested my forehead against the glass. The cold seeped into my skin. Outside, trees bent slightly, leaves trembling. Sounded like whispering. What do you want now? The question didn't come from anywhere specific. It wasn't a voice. It was the space between sounds. The pause after the wind passed. I stepped back. My reflection stared at me again, faint against the window. I didn't recognize the expression. It wasn't sadness exactly. More like uncertainty that had been waiting a long time to be acknowledged. In the bathroom, the mirror was kinder, softer light. I turned the faucet on and washed my hands slowly, watching the water slide over my skin. I noticed how thin my wrists looked, how steady they were. I dried them and leaned on the counter. I whispered very quietly, "I don't know." The words didn't echo. The room absorbed them. Back in the hallway, I opened a drawer I rarely touched. Old tickets, receipts, a small key I couldn't remember the lock for. I held it up. Felt important once. Or maybe it just wanted to be. I placed it back and closed the drawer. The house felt full of these things. Objects waiting to be chosen or released. I realized how much of my life had been arranged around waiting. Waiting for the right time. For permission. For others to be settled first. And now there was nothing to wait for. That thought scared me. And freed me a little. Reclaiming joy. The idea felt dangerous. Like defiance. As if wanting something for myself might undo all the love that came before it. I wondered if joy had rules I'd missed. The wind returned, softer this time. The curtain lifted slightly, then settled. I picked up one postcard again. The village by the sea. The colors were faded. I traced the shoreline with my thumb. I didn't put it back. I carried it to the kitchen and placed it on the table beside the notebook. The two sat together, strangers becoming familiar. Sunlight shifted again, brighter now. It touched the postcard, then the notebook, then the empty chair. I stood there for a long moment. Then I turned the postcard over and wrote one line. Just one. I didn't know what it meant yet. But it was enough for now. The wind outside slowed. The house settled. And somewhere between the coat I never wore and the dreams I never sent, something inside me stirred. Not loud, not sure, but awake. The drawer resisted when I pulled it open. Just a little. Like it hadn't been used to being disturbed. Paper whispered against paper as it slid out. Bills. Receipts. Old instruction manuals for things I no longer owned. The kind of drawer where time collects quietly, without complaint. I knelt in front of it, the kitchen floor cool beneath my knees, and began sorting without any real purpose. Then I saw the corner of it. Glossy. Too bright for this drawer. Pause. The house was still. Even the refrigerator seemed to hush. I pulled the brochure free, careful not to tear it, as if it might be fragile from neglect. Opened easily. Blue spilled out first. Water bluer than anything outside my window. Sand pale and untouched. I let it rest open in my hands. My fingers traced the edge without thinking. A small coastal town stared back at me. Quiet streets. Sunlight on stone walls. A woman walking alone mid-step, as if she hadn't noticed the camera. I sat back against the cabinet and breathed. I remembered when I'd picked it up. Travel agency window years ago. I'd been waiting for him. He was late. I'd gone inside just to pass the time. The woman behind the desk smiled like she already knew I wouldn't book anything. She handed me the brochure anyway. Just in case, she'd said. I'd folded it and slipped it into my bag, embarrassed by how much I wanted it. I turned the page. Quiet towns. No crowds. No rush. The words were simple. Almost apologetic. Slow mornings. Unscheduled afternoons. Nothing required. My chest tightened. I thought about his vacation. The one he'd planned so confidently. Flights. Hotels. A schedule already decided. It was meant to be exciting. Efficient. Full. For both of us. I closed the brochure halfway. Then opened it again. The sound was soft but deliberate. What if I didn't go? The thought arrived gently. No drama. No anger. Just a question slipping into the space that had been left open. I looked around the kitchen. The empty chair. The notebook. The postcard with soon written on it in my careful handwriting. The air felt different. Thicker. Like it had weight now. Possibility has a strange density. It presses in quietly, asking to be acknowledged. I stood and walked to the window, brochure still in my hand. Outside, the afternoon had warmed slightly. Light touched the tops of parked cars. A child passed by on a bicycle, wobbling, laughing to himself. I wondered when I'd last laughed out loud alone. I returned to the table and spread the brochure flat, smoothing the crease with my palm. I noticed details I hadn't before. The way shadows fell on buildings. The absence of people in most photos. It wasn't loneliness. It was space. Fear rose up slowly. Practical fear. The kind that asks about money and timing and permission. I listened to it. Let it speak. Then something else followed. Quieter. Warmer. The faint thrill of imagining myself there. Waking up somewhere unfamiliar. No one waiting for me to be anything. I sat down and closed my eyes. Just for a moment. I pictured the sound of water instead of traffic. The smell of salt instead of coffee. I pictured myself walking without checking the time. My heart beat faster. I noticed it. I opened my eyes. The brochure was still there. Patient. I thought about betrayal. The word felt heavy. Too sharp for this moment. What he had done hurt, yes. But this idea didn't come from anger. It came from the quiet that followed. From the space his choice had carved out. Could I create something of my own inside that space? Picked up my phone. Not to call him. Not yet. I opened a search instead. Just one. My thumb hesitated, then moved. The screen glowed. Inviting. I didn't book anything. I didn't commit. I only looked. Prices. Photos that moved slightly when I scrolled, as if trying to pull me in. My fear sat beside me watching. My excitement stood a little farther back, pretending not to stare. I placed the phone face down and leaned back in my chair. The floor creaked like it remembered. The house didn't protest. I realized something then. Following his plan would be easier. Explaining this to him would not. But ease had never been the same as peace. The brochure rustled as a breeze slipped through the window. One corner lifted, then settled. It felt like an invitation I hadn't yet accepted. I folded it carefully, not the way it had been before. I smoothed it once more and placed it on top of the notebook. The two belonged together now. The clock ticked. Afternoon leaned toward evening. I imagined telling him. Not the words. Just the look on his face. Surprise. Maybe disappointment. Maybe relief. I didn't know. What I did know was this. The idea hadn't scared me away. It had stayed. Quiet. Steady. I stood and carried the brochure to the bedroom. I opened the drawer beside the bed, the one I kept mostly empty, and placed it inside. Not hidden. Just waiting. When I closed the drawer, the sound felt final in a way that surprised me. Not an ending. A beginning with boundaries. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my hands rest in my lap. My heart slowed. The fear softened. The excitement didn't disappear. It only settled deeper. Outside, the light shifted again. Long shadows stretched across the floor. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. The crack above the bed caught the light differently now. I wondered how long it had been there. I wondered how many things I'd lived with without noticing. Smiled. Just slightly. The idea stayed with me as evening came. As the house cooled. As the first lights flickered on outside. I hadn't decided yet. But the story was no longer written for me. And somewhere between fear and possibility, I felt it. The pulse of an untold chapter, waiting for me to turn the page. The house sounded different that afternoon. Not louder. Just more aware of itself. Sunlight spilled through the window at an angle that felt deliberate, settling across the table where the brochure and notebook lay side by side. Dust drifted slowly through the beam, turning the air into something visible. I stood there longer than I needed to, watching those tiny particles move as if they had nowhere else to be. I sat down and opened the notebook. The paper gave a soft resistance under my fingers. Slightly rough. Honest. I liked that. I didn't write yet. I turned pages. Blank ones first. Then the older list. Crossed out dreams. Half-formed thoughts. I smiled without meaning to. Small private smile. The kind you don't explain to anyone. I reached for my phone again. This time I didn't hesitate. I searched slowly, deliberately. Destinations. Well, quiet places. Places no one had ever suggested to me before. Some options made me laugh. Loud. Startled me. The sound echoed once, then disappeared. I hadn't laughed like that in a while. Not because something was funny, but because it felt impossible and thrilling at the same time. I shook my head and whispered, "No." Then I bookmarked it anyway. The sunlight shifted as clouds passed overhead. The room dimmed slightly, then brightened again. I noticed how warm the table felt beneath my palms, how steady my breathing was. Choice felt small, but together they added weight. I clicked through photos of places I'd never seen. Narrow streets, open water, small cafes with mismatched chairs. No crowds, no urgency. I imagined myself there, not as someone's mother, not as someone waiting. Just as myself. The thought made my chest tighten. Not painfully. More like stretching after a long time still. I stood and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down an old atlas I hadn't touched in years. The pages were thin, almost fragile. I traced routes with my finger, following coastlines, borders the long way around. I liked the long way. Back at the table, I wrote a few words in the notebook. Not plans. Not promises. Just names of places. Circle around one. Question mark beside another. Rebellion doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like a pencil mark you don't erase. The chair across from me stayed empty. I noticed it, but it didn't ache the way it had earlier. Felt neutral, like space I was allowed to have. I thought about leaving, about packing, about mornings somewhere else. And then, inevitably, I thought about him. Could I leave without anger? Without making this a statement meant to wound? The questions hovered, unanswered. Let them. Some things don't need immediate answers. The floor creaked when I stood again. Sounded approving. Or maybe I just wanted it to. I poured myself another cup of coffee, though I didn't really want it. The ritual mattered more than the drink. Kettle. Steam. The familiar motions grounding me as my thoughts drifted forward. I carried the mug to the window and watched the street below. A woman walked her dog slowly. A man adjusted his coat against the breeze. Ordinary lives moving forward without ceremony. I wondered if they knew how brave ordinary movement could be. Back at the table, I closed the atlas and stacked the brochure and notebook neatly on top of it. The pile looked intentional now. Ozone. The sunlight returned fully, turning the dust into gold again. I reached out and caught one mode on my finger. It disappeared instantly. Everything felt like that. Fleeting. Worth noticing. I sat down one last time and rested my hands flat on the table. The wood was warm. The house was quiet. My phone lay nearby, screen dark. No messages. No interruptions. I realized then that this wasn't escape. Not really. Escape runs away from something. This felt like moving toward myself. Toward a version of life I'd postponed so long it had almost learned to live without me. The fear was still there. It hadn't left. But it had moved aside, making room for something steadier. Resolve doesn't announce itself. Settles. Like dust. Like light. Outside, the day began to fade. Shadows lengthened across the room, softening edges. I didn't turn on the light right away. I let the dimness arrive. I gathered the papers and carried them to the bedroom. Placed them in the drawer again. Not hidden. Just stored with care. When I closed the drawer, I rested my hand on it for a moment. A quiet promise, not yet spoken aloud. I lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The crack above me seemed less severe now. Just another line in a long story. My heart beat steadily. No rush. No retreat. Somewhere between the choices I'd made and the ones still waiting, I felt it. The calm certainty that I could shape what came next. Slowly. Gently. On my own terms. The room darkened. The house breathed around me. And in that quiet, I understood something simple and strong. I wasn't leaving yet. But I was ready. The screen glowed softly in the darkened room. Not bright. Just enough. Evening had settled in without asking. The house carried that low, blue quiet it always found at night, when the day had finished speaking and nothing had started yet. I sat at the table with only the lamp on, its light pooling around my hands, leaving the corners of the room untouched. The brochure lay folded beside me. The notebook was open, but I wasn't writing. I was listening, to the hum of the refrigerator, to the distant traffic, to my own breathing. Clicked once, then stopped. The cursor blinked patiently like it trusted me. I thought about his trip again. The places he had chosen. Busy. Bright. Planned down to the hour. He liked knowing where he was going next. He liked certainty. I taught him that, I suppose. Or maybe he'd learned it by watching me live without it. I scrolled. Slowly. The small coastal town appeared again. No landmarks I recognized. No famous beaches. Just a name that sounded like it belonged to the wind. The photo showed water breaking against dark stone, white foam rushing in like it had something urgent to say. The sea looked loud. And forgiving. I leaned closer to the screen. The light caught my eyes, made them ache slightly. I didn't look away. The idea of it pressed gently against me. Not demanding. Just present. I imagined standing there, coat pulled tight, hair undone by salt air. I imagined the sound of waves filling the space where my thoughts usually crowded. My mouth tasted faintly metallic. Like nerves. Like salt. Clicked again. Dates appeared. I chose them without too much thought. The less I hesitated, the steadier my hands felt. Departure. Return. The shape of time, suddenly mine to arrange. A flicker of panic rose up. Dark. Quick. What am I doing? I pushed my chair back and stood. The floor creaked like it remembered me from earlier. I walked to the window and opened it a crack. Night air slipped in cool and damp. Somewhere, a siren wailed and faded. I pressed my forehead to the glass and closed my eyes. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was choice. I returned to the table and sat down again. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I noticed a faint tremor in it. I let it be there. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to move with it watching. I imagined the streets of that town. Narrow. Uneven. Doors painted colors I couldn't name. I imagined not knowing where anything was. The quiet discomfort of unfamiliar corners. The relief of being unknown. The unfamiliar pressed gently against my senses in my mind, like a hand on my back guiding me forward. Filled in my name, my email, my details. Each line felt intimate, personal, as if I were introducing myself to a future that hadn't met me yet. The price appeared at the bottom of the screen. I stared at it longer than I meant to. My chest tightened. A memory flickered. My savings account, the empty balance, the way my breath had caught, could still stop. I knew that. I glanced at the phone beside me. Still silent. Still waiting. He hadn't called. Or maybe he had, and I hadn't noticed. I didn't check. Instead, I looked back at the screen. Will you go? The question wasn't written anywhere. It sat between the lines, between the clicks, between the woman I'd been and the one I might become. Thought about peace. What it meant to me now. Not happiness. Not resolution. Just peace. The kind that doesn't argue with you when you wake up. I pressed confirm. The sound was barely audible. Soft click. Final and ordinary at the same time. For a moment nothing happened. Then a message appeared. Your booking is complete. I exhaled without realizing I'd been holding my breath. My shoulders dropped. The room felt suddenly larger. As if something had stepped aside to make space for me. Fear didn't disappear. Shifted. Now it felt like standing at the edge of water. Cold, bracing, alive. I could almost taste the salt again. I closed the laptop and rested my hands on the cover. It was warm from use. Real. This wasn't a dream folded into a drawer. This was done. I stood and walked slowly through the house. Past the couch. Past the photos on the fridge. I noticed them differently now. They weren't accusations. They were chapters. In the bedroom, I opened the wardrobe and touched the coat I'd never worn. My fingers lingered on the sleeve. I imagined wearing it by the sea. Wind pushing against me, waves answering back. Smiled. Just a little. Back in the kitchen, the chair across from the table was still empty. I pulled it out and sat in it briefly, just to see how it felt. Creaked in surprise. I won't be here, I said softly. The room didn't respond. I stood again and turned off the lamp. Darkness settled gently, not rushed. The glow from the streetlight outside traced familiar shapes across the floor. I lay in bed with the window open, listening. The city breathed. Somewhere far away, water moved. Not the sea yet, but close enough to imagine. Would I find the peace I craved? Or would I carry disappointment with me? Unpack it in a different place? I didn't know. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to answer everything before I began. The booking confirmation sat unread in my email. Tomorrow's problem. Tomorrow's proof. Tonight I let the unknown exist without explanation. The house creaked once, settling around me. I closed my eyes and pictured the sound of waves, loud, forgiving, endless. And as sleep found me, one thought stayed, steady and sure. I was already on my way. The bedroom smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. Not strong. Just enough to remind me the room had been mine long before any plan, any schedule. I knelt beside the open suitcase. It lay on the floor like an invitation and a warning at the same time. The zipper hung open, shoulders slack. I rested my hands on the empty space inside. seemed to wait. Patient. Expectant. I reached for the first garment. Soft cotton, worn at the edges, with a faint scent of past washes. I folded it slowly. Once. I pressed the crease with my fingers, as if careful folding could press away the weight that had been accumulating for years. The socks came next. Small, ordinary. They carried no stories themselves, but together with the other clothes, they became part of the ritual. A quiet resistance against the life I had been given, and the one I was now choosing. I noticed the sunlight through the window. It angled across the floor, catching dust motes in tiny golden whirlpools. I watched them for a long moment. The air seemed alive in the stillness, moving gently around the open suitcase. I reached for a small box, tucked under the corner of the bed. Trinkets I had almost forgotten. A keychain from a city we never visited. A shell I picked up on a walk that didn't matter then, but somehow mattered now. I placed them carefully in the suitcase, giving each its own corner. A notebook slid out from beneath the clothes. I hadn't touched it in months. My fingers lingered on the cover. The spine felt familiar, as if it had been waiting for me to remember it. I opened it carefully. The pages were full of scribbles, small lists, reminders. Plans I made quietly, dreams I didn't share. I smiled faintly. Not proud. Not sad. Just aware. Then the photographs slipped from the notebook, and landed softly in my lap. Snapshots. There he was, younger, laughing. Not at anything remarkable, but at everything ordinary. Messy breakfast. Rainy walk. A birthday balloon that had refused to stand upright. My fingers traced the edges. The paper felt thin, almost fragile. The faces stared back at me. He smiled, but not at the camera. He smiled at the world. Or maybe at me. I pressed the photos to my chest, one by one. The suitcase waited. The floor creaked under my weight. The room didn't rush me. I folded the first shirt, then the second. I packed the photographs beside them, letting the soft creases nestle against cotton. Each crease, each careful movement, felt like a small armor, a way to carry memory without letting it spill over. Paused to breathe. The quiet was thick. Outside, a bird called somewhere. Not loud, just a single note. The air smelled faintly of rain from yesterday. I imagined carrying these smells with me. Familiar scents layered into the unknown. The scarf came next. Soft, worn, almost fragile. I held it for a moment against my face. I remembered winter mornings when it had protected me. I folded it and tucked it into the suitcase beside the trinkets. I paused again, listening to my own breathing. The suitcase, now half filled, began to feel like a companion. Carried more than clothes. Carried decisions. Questions. Little joys I didn't know I could take with me. A letter slipped from a book I'd packed earlier. I didn't recognize the handwriting at first. Then I did. My son's. Old folded, soft edges. I opened it slowly, careful not to crease the words further. Mom, I hope you find your sky. Closed my eyes. Not tears. No joy. Just acknowledgement. I folded the letter and placed it carefully into the suitcase. The act of leaving had become ceremonial. Each fold. Each placement. Each pause. Tiny farewell. Not to him. Not to the house. But to the version of myself that had waited silently, rearranging her life for everyone else. I noticed the weight of the suitcase now. Not heavy, but significant, balanced, full enough to feel tangible. A reminder that memory could be carried without breaking me. I leaned back against the wall. The floor creaked like it remembered every step I had taken that morning. I imagined lifting the suitcase, feeling the weight in my arms. It was comforting. The weight meant life, life lived, life remembered. Outside, the sky shifted, pale and quiet. Shadows of the curtains moved across the walls. I breathed in the last moments before leaving. The quiet, the light, the small sounds. Everything felt like it had been waiting for me to notice it. I packed a small sweater last. I held it to my cheek for a moment. Familiar. A promise of warmth in the unfamiliar. I stood slowly. The suitcase sat on the floor, waiting patiently. I zipped it shut. The sound was soft, a small decisive click. I ran my hand over the surface. Smooth, solid, ready. The photographs, the letters, the trinkets, they were all inside. Portable memories, stitched into the fabric of this new chapter. I glanced at the empty chair across the room. Not lonely now. Just space. Waiting. I felt the pulse of the unknown ahead. Not threatening. Not frightening. Just open. I touched the handle of the suitcase. Felt like holding a heartbeat. And in the quiet, I whispered very softly, "I will carry you with me." The room exhaled. The house settled around me. Shadows lengthened. Light softened. And for the first time, leaving didn't feel like an ending. Felt like beginning. The airport smelled like cold metal and coffee. Not bitter. Just alive. Gray morning light spilled through the windows, falling in long stripes across the polished floor. I watched it stretch across the soles of my shoes as I stepped forward, suitcase wheels humming softly behind me. Each roll echoed like a heartbeat. Low. Deliberate. I paused near the entrance, letting the sounds wash over me. Announcements drifted lazily through the hall, distant and impersonal. People moved around me in small, focused orbits, hurried, distracted, their own stories pressing close. I felt both invisible and present, like a quiet note in the middle of a symphony. I clutched the boarding pass in my hand. Thin paper. Fragile. But weighty in significance. I held it against my chest for a moment, feeling the print against my fingers. Promise. My own. I took a deep breath. The scent of brewed coffee drifted past. Warm. Comforting. I let it brush against my senses and then moved on. I walked slowly through the terminal. Each step felt measured, almost ceremonial. My suitcase followed obediently, rolling with a soft, persistent rhythm. The sound mingled with the low murmur of other travelers. Voices, luggage, the occasional laugh, creating a rhythm I could follow. I noticed the reflections in the floor. People bent over their phones, mothers holding small children, couples moving silently together. And there I was, alone in a different way, yet surrounded. I thought of him, my son. Would he forgive this? Would he understand that this wasn't just a journey for the sake of travel, but a journey for myself? The thought made my chest tighten. Not painfully, just noticeable. A quiet reminder that freedom is rarely without cost. I stopped by a row of chairs, looking at the travelers seated there. Some slept, some read. Some stared into the middle distance, waiting. I imagined sitting, watching my reflection in the window, counting the clouds moving across the sky. Instead I stood. I let my gaze wander over the ceiling, over the beams and the skylights. Light cut across the walls in thin, precise lines. Shadows followed behind, obedient and steady. I could feel the quiet pulse of possibility building, like the tide before it meets the shore. I approached the check-in counter. My suitcase weighed in, soft clicks echoing as it passed over the scale. The attendant smiled politely. I returned it faintly, without feeling like I needed to explain anything. The documents exchanged hands, routine and ceremonial. Boarding pass, ticket, identification. I took them and held them for a long moment. This was my permission slip to somewhere I had only imagined before. Somewhere new, somewhere quiet, somewhere my heart could catch its own rhythm again. I moved past the metal detectors, past the small shops with souvenirs that smelled of plastic and perfume. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Not yet. Each step forward made the doubts whisper again. Will he forgive me? Will resentment follow me like a shadow? I let the questions float. I didn't answer. Not yet. I noticed the small details around me. The gentle clatter of wheels on tile. The soft shuffle of papers as someone adjusted their documents. The way the morning light caught on a metallic edge, glinting briefly before passing into shadow. I imagined carrying these sounds with me, layering them under the roar of the sea I would soon hear. I reached the gate. The line moved slowly. People ahead of me spoke quietly into phones, their voices low and hushed. My suitcase hummed against the floor. I let my fingers trace the edge of the handle. Smooth, solid, familiar. I took a breath and let it settle. I thought of the packing, the brochures, the decision I had made. Each small act had built to this. A quiet momentum, slow but unstoppable. I could feel it now, coiling gently in my chest, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and relief. The gate agent called my row. I stepped forward. The boarding pass fluttered slightly in my fingers. Paper thin. Weighty with consequence. I glanced around the terminal one last time. Not at the people. Not at the lights. The space. The movement. The possibility. The silence between the announcements. The quiet spaces that had belonged to me before I realized they were mine to take. I could feel the rhythm of freedom now. Stronger than the doubts. Louder than the whispers. Pulling me toward the unknown, toward a life not pre-written, not borrowed, not dictated. I handed over the boarding pass. The agent scanned it. Soft beep. Routine. Ordinary. Ordinary, yes, but extraordinary to me. I stepped onto the jet bridge. The floor hummed beneath my shoes. My suitcase followed, obedient. The hum of other travelers, the faint mechanical rhythm of the plane, all merged into a slow, quiet symphony that made my pulse quicken just a little. Outside, the sky stretched wide and gray. Promise of openness. I imagined the horizon I had chosen, stretching out beyond the clouds, waiting for me. I let my hand linger on the window. Fingerprints pressed lightly into the glass. Beyond, the tarmac glistened with dew. Planes moved with soft authority. My destination waited, unknown, patient, forgiving. The doubt stirred one last time. Will he forgive me? Will this journey carry only echoes of resentment? I let them pass. I didn't answer. I felt something else instead. Quiet. Steady. The certainty that moving forward, even with questions, was mine to claim. I stepped forward. The plane's door loomed. I felt the small thrill of fear, that sharp taste of salt on the tongue, the same as the first day I had imagined this. I lifted my suitcase. Smooth. Solid. Ready. I inhaled. And I let the unknown take me. The airport faded behind me. And for the first time in years, the rhythm of freedom was louder than the shadow of doubt. The train rumbled to a slow stop. I stepped onto the platform, suitcase scraping softly against stone. The sky was pale, washed with gray that promised sun later. A faint wind carried salt from somewhere just beyond the horizon. It caught in my hair and on my coat, brushing my skin like a quiet greeting. Pause. The world felt different here. Not loud. Not demanding. Just patient. Waiting for me to notice it. The streets were empty. Shutters closed on small cafes. Wooden doors weathered and worn. The faint smell of seaweed and wet stone lingered in the air. I let it drift into my lungs. Town moved slowly. A lazy rhythm in every creaking sign, every flutter of a curtain in the breeze. I followed that rhythm unconsciously, my footsteps soft against cobblestones that had felt the weight of generations. I carried my suitcase behind me, small clicks punctuating each step. Not hurried, not tense. I was learning the pace of somewhere I had never been. I glanced at a cafe window. Me. The tables stacked, chairs inverted. But there was warmth here. Quiet promise. I thought of how few moments like this I had allowed myself in life. Moments where the world moved, and I simply moved with it. I noticed the textures around me. Rough stone, smooth plaster, the uneven cobbles beneath my shoes. I touched the walls lightly with my fingertips as I passed. Cold. Solid. Real. The air smelled faintly of brine and smoke. Somewhere a bell rang softly. Not loud enough to startle, just enough to make me aware of the slow passage of time. I walked toward the water. The sound reached me first, long before I saw it. Waves crashing against dark stone, relentless and insistent. Salt spray kissed my cheeks. My eyes stung a little, but I didn't mind. It was alive, wild, honest. I perched on a worn bench facing the sea. My suitcase rested at my feet. I closed my eyes and listened. Each crash of water a punctuation. Each hiss of retreating tide a quiet reminder of motion, of life continuing beyond plans, beyond expectations, beyond mistakes. A seagull cried somewhere above. Its wings sliced through the gray sky. I imagined it carrying everything I had packed in my suitcase. Not the clothes, not the trinkets, but the weight of uncertainty, the tension of worry, the echo of absence I had carried for so long. For a moment it felt like relief. Small, tentative, but real. I wandered again, this time down a narrow alley lined with whitewashed walls. The texture of peeling paint, the faint scent of dried herbs hanging in small pots outside a door. I noticed it all. I ran my fingers lightly along a wooden gate. Smooth, worn, familiar in its imperfection. A small cat slipped past me, tail high, disappearing into shadow. I smiled softly. The solitude was unfamiliar. At first, a little sharp like the taste of cold salt on my tongue. But then it softened. It didn't demand attention. It didn't accuse. It simply existed with me, like a companion I hadn't realized I was missing. I stopped to watch the water again. A small fishing boat rocked gently at the end of a pier. The horizon was flat, infinite. I thought of everything I had left behind, of the empty chair, the unopened letters, the unasked questions. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel burdened by them. They existed. I existed. And I was allowed to breathe in between. I traced my steps back through the town. Each corner, each doorway, each quiet shadow felt like discovery. I noticed the faint smell of bread from a bakery just opening. A bell jingled as someone pushed a door. I watched a bird perch on a roof, tilting its head curiously at me. I let my gaze linger longer than necessary. There was beauty here. Not the kind that shouts or demands. The kind that waits for attention, patient and generous. The kind that allowed my heart to expand without fear, without comparison, without expectation. I stopped near a small fountain. Water trickled over stone, steady and slow. I rested my hands lightly on the edge. The surface was cool, textured with moss. The sound soothed me. It wasn't distraction. It wasn't escape. It was presence. I realized then that solitude didn't have to be empty. It could hold weightless beauty if you allowed it. It could be quiet companionship if you listened. The sun began to break through the clouds. Light danced across the waves, sparkling like fragments of silver. I lifted my face toward it. Warmth brushed my cheeks. Not harsh, not blinding. Just enough to remind me that days existed beyond walls, beyond plans, beyond expectation. I felt my heartbeat steady. Not racing. Not anxious. Measured. Present. I walked down to the edge of the water. The sand was wet and cold beneath my shoes. The waves lapped at my ankles, insistent and forgiving. I let my suitcase sit a few feet behind me. I didn't need to clutch it here. I didn't need to protect. Closed my eyes. The wind tugged at my hair. The salt kissed my skin. The sound of water filled my ears. I imagined carrying this rhythm inside me. A pulse, slow and steady, that belonged to no one else. Moments of loneliness drifted through, like small shadows at the edge of vision. But they didn't hurt. They were reminders of life's quiet contrast. Of absence and presence. Of loss and possibility. I inhaled the air deeply, tasted the salt, felt the wind, and let it remind me. Solitude could be companion, could be teacher, could be freedom in a form I had not expected, but had been waiting for all along. I opened my eyes and watched the waves again. And for the first time in a long while I felt the world move around me, patient, alive and inviting. I took a step forward. The sand shifted beneath my feet. The tide whispered, and I followed. The room was quiet except for the distant crash of waves. I sat at a small wooden desk, the surface worn and scarred with years of use. A single lamp cast a soft pool of light across the paper in front of me. The sea breeze slipped through the open window, carrying salt and the faint scent of the horizon. It tangled in my hair, brushed my cheeks, and settled on the page like a gentle reminder that I was here. Alone. Present. Listening. I held the pen lightly, letting it hover over the page. The tip trembled slightly. Not with fear but with anticipation. The first word is always the heaviest. I inhaled the scent of ink. Sharp, metallic, alive. The lamp flickered as a gust of wind pressed against the window. I began. I wrote for him first. Each line measured, careful. A mix of love, disappointment, and forgiveness. Not just for him, but for myself too. I thought of the empty chair at home, the unopened accounts, the vacation I hadn't taken. I thought of mornings spent counting pennies, of quiet sacrifices no one acknowledged. And yet I didn't write anger. I wrote truth. The pen scratched softly across the page. Ink pooled in small rivulets where my hand lingered too long. Pause. Read what I had written. Felt fragile. A glass. Outside, the waves hit harder, then receded. The rhythm matched my heartbeat. Slow, steady, but insistent. I folded the letter carefully. Corners aligned, creases sharp. It was small, simple, but heavy in weight. I placed it in the chest beside me, a quiet repository of intention. Then I wrote to myself. A letter I didn't intend to mail. A letter to hold. To read. To remember. The words flowed differently. Gentle. Encouraging. Tender. I acknowledged the courage it took to come here, to leave the familiar, to reclaim a life that had been quietly deferred for decades. I wrote of possibilities. Of mornings I might greet the sun over the water. Of streets I could wander without apology. Of laughter soft and unplanned. Sometimes I paused to close my eyes. Felt the weight of the pen, the texture of the paper beneath my fingers. Smelled the ink. Smelled the salt. Felt the room shrink around me, intimate and safe. I folded that letter carefully too. Laid it beside the first. A small chest now full of intentions. Not obligations. Not demands. But reminders that life is mine to write, mine to hold, mine to shape. I lingered over the chest for a moment. The letters were more than words. They were a reclamation. A quiet exorcism of the guilt and sorrow I had carried. Each fold, each stroke of the pen, each carefully chosen word, an act of authority over my own story. Outside, a gull cried and the wind tugged insistently at the curtains. I imagined it carrying pieces of the letters out to sea. Maybe he would read them someday. Maybe he would understand. Maybe they would remain silent, waiting, echoes in the quiet room. I didn't know. But I did know this. I had written. I had named my truth. I had allowed the words to exist, and in doing so, had allowed myself to exist fully without apology. I stood and walked to the window. The town below was quiet. Lamps flickered along the streets. The sea beyond glimmered faintly in moonlight. The wind pressed my coat against my shoulders. I imagined carrying this moment inside me for years to come. I thought of how small acts, letters, a suitcase, a journey, could ripple quietly, unseen, into something larger. How reclaiming narrative doesn't have to be loud. How a quiet evening, a pen, and a chest can hold as much power as a shouted declaration. I pressed my hand to the window pane. Cold. Solid. Real. The waves whispered below. I whispered back. I returned to the desk. One last glance at the letters. They sat there patient, waiting. I didn't need to seal them tonight. The act had already done its work. I dimmed the lamp. The room softened into shadow. The sea continued its steady rhythm. The wind carried faint notes of ink and salt through the open window. I breathed deeply. And for the first time in a long while I felt that quiet, solid relief that comes from claiming your story. From acknowledging what was lost, and what could still be found. Closed my eyes. The letters rested in the chest. The room listened. And I let it be enough. The horizon beyond the window remained wide, infinite, patient. I could hear the sea even when I wasn't looking. I could feel the possibility, steady and insistent, like a heartbeat beneath my own. And I knew, whether he read the letters or not, the bridge had been built. Not across miles. Not across years, but across the quiet gap between who I was and who I was becoming. I turned away from the desk, leaving the letters behind. Not forgotten, but placed carefully. Promise. Record. A gentle reminder that even in silence, choices can speak louder than words. The plane hummed beneath me, a steady low vibration that I could feel through the soles of my shoes. I settled into my seat by the window, suitcase tucked beneath. Outside, clouds rolled slowly, soft and endless, catching the last hints of sunlight. I pressed my forehead lightly against the cool glass. The sky stretched like a promise. Pale, infinite, patient. For the first time in days, I felt that calm pulse inside me. Quiet. Steady. Green. I watched the horizon blur as the plane climbed. Cities below shrank into patterns of gray and gold. The familiar yet distant shapes made my chest ache in a way that wasn't sorrow. It was recognition. A subtle understanding that I had changed, and that the world had noticed, even if only in small ways. I remembered the small coastal town, the endless rhythm of the waves. The streets where the wind whispered secrets only I could hear. The letters I had written, each word folded carefully, deliberate in its tenderness. The solitude, the laughter at small absurdities, the moments where I simply inhaled the air and let myself exist. All of it settled around my chest like a soft cloak. A warmth that didn't push, didn't demand, didn't rush. I pressed my hand to the window again. The reflection staring back at me was familiar and strange. A woman softened at the edges, yes, but sharper too. Calmer, yes, but certain. The eyes were quieter now, carrying an honesty that hadn't been there before. I almost didn't recognize her. And yet I liked her. The seatbelt clicked as the plane leveled. I exhaled slowly, feeling the vibration of the engines hum through my ribs. A small notebook rested on my lap. I traced the spine with my fingers. It had traveled with me, collecting small observations, moments of thought, fragments of the horizon. I had not filled it completely, but every page held intention, careful attention, and the quiet pulse of a life reclaimed. Beside me, a child laughed softly. Somewhere down the aisle, a mother adjusted her scarf. The mundane sounds of travel felt gentle, grounding. I realized I hadn't noticed them before. I had carried life as if it were a burden, always moving, always doing. Now I simply watched, and it felt extraordinary. The plane began its descent. City lights flickered below like fireflies, scattered across dark streets. I could see the river winding, the familiar bridges, the patterns of rooftops I had walked over so many times. It was home. And yet it wasn't the same. I was not the same. I imagined stepping off the plane, walking through the terminal, suitcase rolling behind me with soft clicks. I imagined seeing him, my son, waiting. I did not know how he would react. Perhaps surprise. Perhaps guilt. Perhaps understanding. But I knew one thing. The bond between us had shifted, deepened in honesty, strengthened in subtle ways. I felt a faint tremor of anticipation, like the pull of the tide on bare feet. Not fear. Not hesitation. Just the recognition that some things could only be approached with quiet courage. I leaned my head back against the seat. The clouds stretched into pale gold as the sun dipped lower. Shadows lengthened across the wing. A distant hum of conversation reached me. The world was ordinary yet alive. I breathed deeply, tasting the faint scent of the cabin air, and felt the rhythm of my own heartbeat align with it. I thought of the choices I had made. Small acts that had seemed inconsequential at the time. Booking the town, walking the empty streets, listening to the waves, writing letters. All of it had shaped me. All of it had reminded me that life was mine to hold, to fold, to carry without apology. I touched the letters in my mind, folded and placed in a small chest far away, yet present in my memory. The act of writing had been a reclamation, a quiet exorcism. And now, as I returned, I carried that reclamation inside me. A pulse beneath my ribs, steady and soft. The plane dipped lower, the city spreading beneath like a living map. I could see familiar streets, familiar buildings, familiar patterns of life humming on their own. And I realized, with a gentle clarity, that familiarity no longer meant constraint, could now hold freedom if I allowed it. If I allowed myself. I imagined him waiting, wondering what had changed, what I had learned, what I had become. I wondered what stories I would tell him, and what stories I would no longer tell, choosing instead to carry them quietly within. The engines thrummed beneath me, steady. I could hear the soft rustle of passengers adjusting, the faint creak of overhead bins. And through it all, I felt a quiet certainty that I had returned not just to a place, but to myself. The plane touched down. The tires hummed against the runway. The vibration traveled through my body, a reminder of motion, of momentum, of arrival. I let my hands rest in my lap, fingers brushing lightly over the notebook. I did not need to rush. I did not need to prepare. I simply existed, fully present, fully aware. The airport lights gleamed through the windows. The cityscape beyond twinkled faintly, welcoming, familiar, and distant all at once. I breathed in the faint scent of jet fuel and human movement, the ordinary perfume of life resuming. And I felt ready. I reached for my suitcase. The wheels clicked against the floor, a soft echo. Every step toward the exit carried the rhythm of my own pulse. Every glance at a stranger, a passing moment, a piece of architecture felt like a story I was observing rather than a life I had to inhabit under duress. I imagined opening the door, stepping into the arms of sunlight and familiarity. I imagined his face, perhaps puzzled, perhaps relieved, perhaps surprised. And I felt no fear, only readiness. This was not a return to the life I had paused. This was a return to a life reclaimed. I pressed my hand to the window one last time as we rolled to the gate. The reflection stared back at me, calm, certain, subtly altered. Stronger, quieter, full of the quiet authority that comes from choosing for oneself. I exhaled slowly. The city awaited. He awaited. And I walked toward both, carrying the quiet certainty of a journey completed, or perhaps a rebirth just beginning. The question hung softly, unresolved. Was this simply a vacation? Or had it been something more? I smiled faintly and stepped forward.